Hi, good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Wednesday night CPD session. And I'm very happy and pleased and honored to have with me today Ms. Shanti Abraham, who is a Malaysian lawyer who specializes in medical legal matters and particularly is interested in medical mediation, which is the topic of today's talk. Okay, now before I hand the mic over to Shanti, I have to go through some housekeeping slides. So please bear with me. I think those of you who have gone through our previous CPD sessions will know the drill, but this is for the benefit of those who are new. Okay. What we would like you guys to do is to use Slido to ask questions when which will only should be only at the end of the talk. Okay. In order to use Slido, you can open the Slido app on your mobile phone and enter the code H875, or else you can use your barcode scanner or QR code scanner, scan that code there, and then it will open Slido for this session. Please note that QR code is not for CPD points, so don't get excited and use the MMA app to try to scan for CPD points. Okay, so we will only answer questions at the end of the talk. In order to claim CPD points, we will display the actual QR code for this lecture at the end of the talk. And then you can use the MMA Events app. And when you tap on the scan QR on the upper left, as indicated in the picture, circle in red, that will open up your camera, and then you will scan the QR code displayed at our top. And I will put the QR code in the blank space here, okay? Just be patient, not going to show it just yet. But for those of you who didn't manage to catch this talk live, it will be made available for viewing in our bulletin board. So this video will be hosted right up until 30th of June next year. And you can still get points by answering MCQs. One of the questions will be a keyword, which I'll mention towards the end of the talk. So just to make sure that whoever is trying to answer the questions also has actually listened to the talk. So watch out for the keyword, which I'll mention at the end of the talk. Okay. Now, one last thing is I'd just like to acknowledge Dr. Shield, our friends at Dr. Shield, who have been organizing this monthly series of medical legal talks. So Dr. Shield is a medical indemnity or practitioner indemnity company. So you can go to the drshield.com and get a free quote if you're interested or have not got your practitioner indemnity yet. Okay. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over the microphone to Shanti, who will begin her talk on the medical mediation. Shanti, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Allen. Thank you so much for this invitation. It's a real privilege to be here. And thank you to Dr. Shield for inviting me to share my views on something that's very, very close to my heart for many, many years. In fact, for more than a decade, medical mediation has been something that I have been looking into, and it's a privilege to share with your audience today, Dr. Tay, my views about the medical legal landscape, as well as the role that medical mediation will play. Now, as I start, I want to just point to a couple of things. When we talk about medical mediation, the question is, what is it? Is it just a facilitated conversation with an agenda? And the answer is yes. In a very small way of putting it, it is to explain what has happened, to discuss fair compensation if that is warranted. And it gives an opportunity for doctors and patients and hospitals to rebuild relationships which may have suffered from an adverse reaction or from an unexpected outcome. From a doctor's perspective, from a hospital's perspective, it is also to protect the reputation of the doctors and also from the hospital's perspective. Now, From the patient's perspective, medical mediation offers an opportunity to understand in a confidential setting what has happened, why it happened, and perhaps how to find closure or to find a forward step going forward. Now, in the course of my next half hour, I'll be talking about healthcare mediation and the genesis of a dispute, what causes an escalation, the challenges on the ground, and what may be necessary going forward. Now, let me just start with the relationship. For all the doctors who are listening today, when a patient walks in through the front door of your hospital or your clinic, that is at most important an expression of trust. Health being something that people are referred to as the real wealth is something that they put into the doctors and hospitals' hands because they want an outcome and go back to their life as they know it. It is a relationship, and no matter how lawyers and the corporations put it as a contractual relationship or otherwise, at its very heart, a doctor-patient, patient-hospital relationship is the key and cornerstone to the relationship that the parties have started off when they walk in through the door. Now, when things go wrong or have perceived to have gone wrong, the reality is that trust is shattered. Expectations, which the patient came into the hospital with, are crushed, or the parties are disappointed, and an adverse outcome has the potential of changing the life of that patient as he or she or the family knew it. And herein lies the problem. This is the genesis of a medical dispute. So, to summarize, what are the causes of escalation? Poor outcome is a no-brainer. When parties come for health advice or treatment, their expectation is that they will have a positive or a holistic outcome. A poor outcome is not what they wanted, not what they paid for, and certainly not what they expected. Now, matters can be escalated if the relationship between the doctor and the patient or the hospital and the patient is made worse or exacerbated by poor communication. Poor communication could be insufficient communication or even passive communication, where the patient's questions are not addressed in a way that fully explains to that patient what could have happened. Now, in the old days, parties used to sometimes be at terms with an adverse outcome, surrendering it to fate or destiny or the workings of an act of God. But today, things are different. Age complication brings with it the potential of increased costs. And with increased costs, parties become and patients become more anxious about having to pay for the mistakes that they perceive has happened. And then these poor patients and patients as well as their families face complicated resolution structures where they feel that the trusted entity or the trusted doctor that they were working with suddenly build up barriers and then put the patient in a position where their only option is to go for an adversarial approach in finding a solution. And this is how a medical dispute escalates into a potential litigation. So when we take a step back as lawyers, as doctors, as professionals, we look at the various parties in this scenario, and we need to recognize their vulnerabilities. And the vulnerability is both from the doctor's perspective as well as the family's perspective. The corporate hospital has to deal with all of this fallout and oftentimes are not fully equipped to deal with a familial response because they're looking at things from a corporate perspective. When one looks at any type of dispute, and as a mediator, we often look at this dispute in a four-step process. oftentimes there is a disagreement between parties. It is when the disagreement is not handled in an appropriate way that it metamorphosizes into a dispute. And then, if that dispute is not handled wisely and delay comes into the picture, it can spiral into a disaster. And this is the foundation on which a lot of litigation builds. In mediation, we always talk about looking at things from the other person's perspective. And in a medical legal matter, we look at things from multiple parties' positions. Just give me a second. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. There was an interruption. Now, we never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view. Couldn't be more true than in a medical legal setting. Because when a patient sees an adverse outcome, they need to have an opportunity to vent, to seek explanation, and to seek clarification for what has happened. Um, so sorry, just give me a moment. I'm trying to apologize for this. My apologies. Now, moving forward, what are the challenges on the ground? And what are the challenges that most doctors face when they are dealing with a medical dispute? They know that there is this opportunity to mediate, but where do they go? What do patients understand about mediation? The first thing is this: mediation is a voluntary process. So if patients do not even understand what mediation is, they are going to be hard pressed to be able to come to the hospital or to the doctor to be able to explain that what they want is an explanation and in some cases compensation. In this setting, a mediator who is a neutral facilitator is required, who will help the parties identify the issues which are critical to help parties understand each other, to identify their needs, to facilitate a communication, and the most important, to help overcome impasses. You know, many times doctors have told me, no doctor wakes up wanting to have an adverse outcome. And while I understand that narrative, the same would apply to any of us getting into a car in the morning, and none of us start the morning expecting to have an accident or any unfortunate outcome. And yet, if we do, the first reaction would be to find some solutions before us. The landscape for the medical legal society, the medical legal landscape, is such that the first time a patient has an adverse experience, they do not have a very clear avenue of where to go, who to speak to. And the current patient grievance mechanism is a very clinical approach to patients where they are invited to come and have a rather cold discussion where the parties in the picture may be speaking from their own vested interests. It is very difficult in such a scenario to speak about solutions which both parties are able to live with, because the first interest that everyone in the room has is to justify or to defend their positions. So therein lies one of the bigger difficulties about medical mediation. The lack of an access to a neutral facilitator who will be able to navigate this all-important conversation. If parties' aim is to achieve a swift and effective solution, the role of a neutral facilitator cannot be understated. So let me just talk about the challenges on the ground. And I'll be focusing on some practical steps and how to avoid some pitfalls. These are some of the practical steps. You need to start with the right conversation. And when we talk about having the right conversation, these are some of the important things to bear in mind in the preparation for this right conversation. The preparation involves wanting to authentically explain to the parties what happened. And it is perfectly acceptable if parties want to protect their reputation. But the goal would always have to be to understand where the unhappy party is coming from and perhaps to look for solutions that parties can live with. Now, to discuss fair compensation is something that parties sometimes find difficult, and they often need to have the backing of their indemnity provider. From a corporate perspective, it may appear that rebuilding relationships is not a priority, but this can't be further than the truth, because once the relationship between the doctor and the patient is re-established, to be able for the patient or their families to understand that there was no ill intention, or that the best options had been utilized for their family member, or that the outcome was not guaranteed in a known and explainable way, one would be surprised to find how bridge building can work. It is very difficult when when the parties are in two separate sides of the table, eager to explain their own perspective, with no neutral in between to help bridge that gap. You know what they say? In mediation, we always say that 10% of conflicts are due to differences of opinion. But the reality is that 90% are due to the wrong tone of voice. And the wrong tone of voice in a medical dispute context is sense of defensiveness that all the parties will speak with, which tends to not lend towards bridge building, but to actually polarize the parties who are in a dispute. A second practical step: get the right parties at the right time in the right room. Now, who are the right parties? In a simple medical dispute, a doctor and patient with a neutral mediator could be the right parties. But there are many times the issues are far more complex. And in those cases, the patient will be well advised to have a legal representative who would have, prior to a mediation, explained what their rights and opportunities are, and similarly with the doctor and the hospital. And this multi-party mediation would be best done with a mediator who understands the complex relationships between the three parties. But this is the other question: who decides this? How does this happen? If you were a patient, how would you navigate yourselves? And the bigger question is, who pays for it? And from a corporate perspective, why bother? And from patient's perspective, where can this happen? These are important questions for parties to consider. For patients who are grappling with the shock of an adverse reaction or adverse outcome, the reality is that leadership needs to come from the healthcare providers to be able to navigate the patient, to be able to recognize that while this was the last expectation for the doctor and the hospital, nevertheless, because the patient's interests actually are very important, that there is a mechanism where a dialogue can be facilitated. And this is where the indemnity providers become very important. In order to have an authentic conversation to help parties get to a solution, the question is, does the patient have enough information to mediate? This is a very, very important factor, because in many instances, patients are running blind, wondering whether something had happened and having no clue whether things were being concealed from them. Some very wise PICs have shared with me how they've recognized this gap and in their own context, been able to help patients close that gap of ignorance or unawareness by sharing what is actually in the medical records in order to help the patients understand that everything that could have been done was done for their family member or for themselves. In order to start an authentic conversation, everyone in the room needs to have a satisfactory amount of information including in some circumstances, expert reports, in order to have that all-important discussion of where the problem is, where the problem is now, and where the problem could be if the parties were to discuss the issues in an honest and productive way. But a lot of times, this particular scenario doesn't play out. And one of the reasons is this. Indemnity providers often take a position that they are on a defense mode. Very few have a mediate first policy. And I'm proud to be associated with this seminar today, which is sponsored by Dr. Shield. I understand that Dr. Shield is one of the first indemnity providers to have a mediate first policy. And I look forward to more indemnity providers actively looking at mediation as a way to find solutions at the earliest possible time when patients need to be navigated and to have that authentic conversation. So the reality is this. Leadership starts with the paymasters. And the question that one needs to reflect on is, are indemnity providers prepared to consider a swift resolution? Today's grievance mechanisms give much to be desired. Many times, grieving patients or unhappy patients receive a cold letter which invites them for a conversation, but is also carefully worded so that the patient understands that they need to be on the defensive. Oftentimes, the opaque commercial considerations, which are real, make a patient distrust the patient grievance mechanisms which are available. And in some contexts, there may be benefits to slow payouts, which is unfortunate, but perhaps the reality. And in some cases, there are parties who believe that instead of engaging the counterparty, it just might be better to exhaust them and hopefully they'll go away. So as with all my presentations on mediation, it's time to pause and reflect. We know that medical disputes often rise from an adverse outcome or a perceived adverse outcome. This is where there is an expectation let down. We need to start thinking through problems in a different way. We need to consider the importance of authenticity. And in order for authentic problem solving, this requires transparency. This is enough to strike a lot of terror in many people's hearts. But true medical reports, medical records, and expert reports are actually instrumental to a successful medical mediation. But you know what doesn't work? When patients or their families feel they're being managed in a way that gives them no option but to go to battle, that doesn't work. Comes back to a practical step number 3. We need the right people at the right time, in the right room, with the right objective. Even if that objective is to explain in an authentic way that the patient's perception is wrong, this needs to be done in a way that the patient buys into the process and understands and is given the opportunity to ask the right questions. What is the right objective? It's on the basis of truth and fairness. At the end of the day, if the goal in the healthcare industry is to achieve swift, reasonable resolutions, which would otherwise escalate to litigation, medical mediation has a lot of opportunities for the medical profession. So these are some of the pitfalls before we think that it's all an easy process. Getting the wrong people in the room. The wrong people would be someone who has no authority or ability to agree, someone with a vested interest to present a defense position only. Those people would probably make a patient or their family feel as if they need to defend themselves. Even if you have the right people at the right time, if the wrong objective is, if the parties come with the wrong objective, this will derail medical mediation. And from the patient's perspective, if the objective is to punish the doctor, medical mediation is not going to work. And the same way, if from a hospital and doctor's perspective, if the problem is treated as a nuisance, something easy to dismiss, or something to exhaust the patient, that objective will not yield a solution that will be bought by the parties who participate in the mediation. And the most important pitfall is having the wrong conversation. And the wrong conversation is one where the parties are made to feel humiliated or for even inquiring about the adverse event that took place. To wrap up on the practical steps and pitfalls, medical mediation can be done and can be done successfully when parties manage expectations. And I emphasize the need to be authentic and the ability to appreciate perspective. In this short seminar, I'm not going to be able to share with you some of the incredible mediation success stories that we have observed, where parties start their battle with lots of numbers on a piece of paper, which is nothing more than their emotions poured on a piece of paper. And we are able to resolve the dispute within one day using this approach. How? How do you get a patient through the front of a mediation? This is an important question. These three things are critical. There needs to be a genuine intention to address concerns. You need to have a system or advisors with an ethical agenda to want to find a solution as swiftly as possible. And in a nod to our sponsors today, you need to have an indemnity providers who have an active Mediate First program. In this way, parties as well as the doctors and the hospitals who are involved in an unfortunate dispute have the navigational tools to be able to engage the parties who are unhappy or disappointed in some way to at least come in for a confidential discussion to see whether there is a way to find a solution that both or all three parties can live with. So going forward, these are the challenges facing patients. The costs of complications are high. Facing doctors, escalating premiums, and something that cannot be trivialized, the emotional and mental stress of an all-out battle. And for the indemnity providers, with increasing costs and ineffective systems, an all-out adversarial dispute is invariably going to cost more than a swifter, effective solution like mediation. Now, by and large, mediation is no guarantee that the parties are going to reach a solution, but it is certainly a good start. This is a quick snapshot of medical mediation today. It's currently very ad hoc, and it really depends largely on the advisor. Why is medical mediation taking so long to take root in Malaysia? One very simple reason. We lack the systemic framework. We know what it is. Most people know where to find it. The question is who can do it, how and when. It really starts with a larger look at the medical legal ecosystem. And the reality is this: the capital markets has already started looking at these kind of issues. They have established institutions like SIDREC, where investors can go to and have their issues looked at and mediated as well as adjudicated. It is an interesting thing that the healthcare industry, facing the kind of issues that it has been slow for all the stakeholders to come together and look at dispute resolution, and maybe the time is now. The reality is this, and I quote some futurists who say that nobody wants lawyers or doctors or teachers. The reality is that people want solutions. They want health and education. And even behind solutions, fundamentally, people want to be heard. People want to have some guidance, and most people want to have some engagement when they're facing a crisis. And in wrapping up today's seminar, I ask one question. What should be the future of problem solving in the medical legal industry? And I'm going to leave you with a thought. Who does it begin with? The doctors alone cannot solve this problem. The lawyers alone cannot solve this problem. The hospitals alone cannot solve this problem. And the indemnity providers alone cannot solve this problem. This will be a multifaceted process which involves all the stakeholders coming together and deciding that there is value to finding swift solutions to disputes that arise. And in closing tonight, I want you all to reflect. Does mediation fit into the larger objective of the healthcare industry as you know it? Think about this. Each deed is like a seed. You need to choose them wisely because they will either grow thorns or flowers. And on that note, I thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Shanti, for a fantastic talk. I think it's something which isn't talked about much. As you say, a lot of people dread disputes because they dread the adversarial sort of context that we
Yes.
fear it might turn out to be. Whereas yours seems to be the more gentle and logical approach to this to solving arguments. Essentially, that's what it is, or disputes or misunderstandings, right? Okay, now we are going to open this to questions. So what I'm going to do is share the um, Slido screen. 1 second.
I need my specs.
Okay, first question we can see, yeah, from Sundram is what's the percentage of cases settled by mediation compared to court
I
cases?
wouldn't have those sort of statistics, to be very frank with you. Now, I need to explain that there are two types of mediation. One is mediation, which is ad hoc, that happens in a private setting, as well as mediations that happen in a court setting. So the court mediations is usually on the journey towards a trial. The parties are steered into a court centered mediation, often by a judge or a registrar, and there are no statistics that I can point to authentically. No, but I can tell you this: for medical mediations, by and large, and I would say the settlement rates are close to 80 to 90%, and this would be consistent with mediation rates in other areas as well. You know, it's not just medical mediation has got good statistics. So that would be my response to that question.
Would you consider, let's say, if the patient has a complaint and then they meet up with the hospital representatives and the doctors, this patient, hospital representatives, doctors, but there's no
Right.
actual neutral mediator. You didn't have that. Is that a form
It's
of
not a form of mediation. It's a form
or
of negotiation or discussion, and that too can work. Bearing in mind, there are many PICs as well as doctors who are trained mediators, and they would have to be the invisible mediator in the room. And typically, what would happen when, let's say, you have a hospital representative, a doctor, as well as a patient, the typical response is that each person is trying to protect their own position. So there are blinkers in that conversation, and they do not have the ability to step outside themselves to be able to observe how their defense mode is not being accepted or being bought by the person listening. And a classic example would be a hospital whose first reaction to a patient is, please understand our doctor is an independent contractor. Now, for a patient who pays one bill with the doctor's name on it, that is a position in law that the patient is not expecting to hear, because it sounds like the hospital is moving away from the doctor and creating a silo around to protect themselves. So we've heard responses that patients go, when they're issuing a bill, they'll issue it with everybody in, but when there's a problem, they go to their separate corners. And that's not, in my view, a productive way of starting a conversation if your goal is to find a solution.
Right. Okay. Now there's a question from Dr. Horn. What happens at
Yes.
the end of a successful mediation? Is there a binding document executed?
Right. So typically, if there's a settlement agreement, that means there is some compensation. Then that agreement will be signed. It will be binding insofar as it is a contract, which means that if the party who doesn't pay, if the party doesn't pay, then that's an act. The party who is receiving some money has the right to pursue it. Now, something I need to explain in a mediation, it's not as simple as party A paying party B, and then that's the end of the discussion. There's usually a conversation about how the party is going to pay, when they're going to pay, and there is an exercise that the mediator takes the paying party to ensure that there is compliance. Now, that is when money is involved. Sometimes it is nothing to do with money, but it is a matter of different perceptions or the feeling that something untoward may have happened, negligence, for example. There have been resolutions where the parties have ended a mediation simply by acknowledging the other side with thanks, and it's not a binding agreement because the parties have understood what has actually happened. Now, in those sort of circumstances, of course, parties walk away wondering whether it may come back as a suit, but so far, touch wood, in my experience, where it has been well navigated, the matter closes without further complication.
So in effect, it's like a out of court settlement before going to court. Is that
Yes,
what this is?
it's a pre-action dispute resolution. It's pre-action dispute resolution.
So there's another comment from anonymous. How do you know or find out the patient is all out to punish the doctor?
Very good question. There are patients who harbor the idea that punishing the doctor will make them feel better about what has happened. And oftentimes, that's where a neutral can be helpful, because once they have conversations which allow the patient or their family to vent, sometimes that's all that is required. But I can share that in my practice, if there is a patient who makes it very clear that their goal is to punish a doctor, I find it very difficult to suggest mediation because I know that's not going to be satisfactory for in their larger emotional context. So I think that this is where, if mediation were to mainstream and it became much easier for patients to explore their options, to talk their issues through, this idea of punishing a doctor, which might be a knee-jerk reaction, might slowly be muted down because they've had the chance to vent.
Okay. Some people have been posting in Facebook, Doc's Facebook, this is being streamed to as well.
Okay.
I can bring up a comment here, and Dr. Renuka, it says, "Thank you for organizing this talk. Much appreciated. Thank you for your kind
Thank
words."
you, Dr. Renuka.
Dr. Lim Yu Chen has this question.
Yeah.
From cases you mediated, are there instances where doctor could have avoided the adverse events if he has just done more investigation than strictly required?
Well, in a mediation, we don't go into that much forensic detail of what the doctor could have done or should have done. In many cases, we actually only talk about the fact scenario and give the doctor a chance to explain what has happened. And I think in reflection, and this is something that's very important, the doctor is also grappling with elements of personal regret, because in some situations, it's just a matter of bad communication, which was made worse when the outcome was was an adverse one. Had the communication been better, or had a particular nurse communicated some information more clearly, there are usually lots of pieces in the picture, and in the conversation that we have during mediation is to identify what could have been done better, and then use that to look towards the future. And I can just summarize that again. Mediation is about recognizing the past in the context of the present with an eye of deciding how the future is going to look like, right? So obviously everyone takes learning points from that, including the hospital and the doctor.
Yeah. Okay, we've got one question. Sorry, it's very large.
No,
Shanti,
it's
it's
okay. I
covered.
can read this. Yes.
Um, the PHFSA provides an avenue for grievance mechanisms. Is there a
Yes.
structured generic process in private hospitals? I agree with you that silos are created for self-preservation of hospital or doctor. So in my opinion, failure of communication is a prime culprit. So I'm
I
not sure this
completely
is
agree.
more a
Comment.
statement, a comment
Yeah.
than a question.
So, Mr. Lim or Dr. Lim, I completely agree with you, Dr. Lim. This is something I have thought about, spoken about for 10 years. But one thing I am humble enough to recognize is that this is not something that one segment of the stakeholders can solve by themselves. It requires multiple parties working together and actually wanting to solve this problem. It will not happen just by having some small or one interest group alone.
I have a question. I mean, what makes the mediator neutral?
What makes the mediator neutral?
I
Very
mean,
simply, the mediator
who?
will have no vested interest going forward. And this is what I mean when I say that when you even have a mediate first policy among indemnity providers, I have taken on relatively a strong view that mediation advisors should not have the incentive of then becoming the litigation advisors, because
Yes.
human nature being what it is, right?
Mm.
If your role is to be a mediation advisor, therein should lie where your mandate is. I'm a little bit surprised sometimes when doctors get really excited because their indemnity provider provides them free lawyers, and I'm going, why does that excite you? That means that lawyers not incentivized to solve your problem in that first hour. And for those of us who have been doing this for many years, a lot of times we can come up with a game plan within the first few hours, even if we don't have all the information immediately in front of us. So it's a bit of rethinking about the dispute resolution landscape, and with this COVID-19, mediation has just come straight to the forefront. People are looking at it from even the commercial side. When I became a mediator, healthcare mediation was my first point of interest. And I've watched other industries do mediation, construction, capital markets. Healthcare seems to have taken a slow walk, still talking about solving problems in court. And it's not something one person can solve.
We have another question, which also
Sure.
I have a question. Does a medical mediator have to be a lawyer? How do we become a certified medical
Well,
mediator?
Malaysian Mediation Center runs courses, which is a 5-day, full-day program. We've had doctors who train as mediators. And in Singapore, where the Ministry of Health, MOHH, has a healthcare mediation scheme, it is made up of doctors, lawyers, social workers, and various other professionals. And in Singapore, they tend to do it co-mediation, either a doctor and a lawyer or one of those combinations. In Malaysia, it's a little bit more ad hoc. It depends on your advisor, and the advisor will suggest mediators who they feel would suitable for the problem.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Lim, for your question. I think, let me check whether any other questions. No, I think we've coming to the end of the talk. So,
Thank you so
Shanti,
much.
this what we are going to do now is show the CBD points.
Okay.
So, this is where the moment some of you are waiting for. So, so that's the Slido slide. Okay, claiming a point, use your QR codes scanner. I'm afraid you cannot scan and watch with the same device due to the current limitations of the system. So some people have been watching with their mobile phone, and then you want to scan with the same mobile phone, it's not possible. But that will come probably next year when there's a revamp of the MMA app, you may be able to take a screenshot and then load the QR code directly into the MMA app. Maybe that's the way we will go moving forward, but that will take a revamp of the app. Okay, now this is the moment you've been waiting for. So this is the QR code. So you can take your mobile phone like this, launch the MMA events app. I'm doing this to make sure I got the right code up, and then you got points for the wrong event. Done that before. Okay, yeah. And then if need be, there is a refresh icon in the events app if you don't see the point. I see that I got the point and it's recorded. So it should be immediate. Once you scan the code, it will show in the CPD records tab, and you'll add a point onto your cumulative CPD. If it is not there, please refresh and it should appear. If there are any issues, you can contact me. Sometimes it's because people have put in the wrong IC number and things like that. Let me do a final check if there are any other questions. No, there are no questions. Yeah, I will leave this slide up for a while. But in the meantime, I don't think I will take Shanti's time anymore. So thank you very much. It's a very enlightening talk. Yeah, I think probably that sounds like a better way forward than, a more adversarial sort of approach, battling out and so on. I think nothing better than talking, negotiating, understanding. I think that's the key thing. I think I find a lot of times there's unhappiness because of poor understanding. Maybe the patient doesn't understand so much what has gone wrong, or they have misconceptions. And the doctor also may not have understood what the patient understands. Sometimes we think they know, but they don't know. At the end of the day, it's a totally, the idea of what is going on is completely different from what we think they should be understanding. Yeah. So
and maybe
it's
just point out one of the reasons why that difficulty is to understand and listen is because all parties are operating from some level of fear. And fear is a very powerful emotion which can cloud our ability to listen. And I think that's often something that the process of mediation helps parties calm down to be able to listen to each other. And it's really extraordinary what can happen.
Yeah, but actually, be surprised. I mean, I can just share one instance where the patient was wondering why, eventually the patient died because of an infection, and thought that I thought it was getting better. And the reason why he thought it was getting better was the temperature came down, but actually that was because the patient became hypothermic, and actually the patient is more septic and ill. So sometimes we can't assume things. Sometimes the understanding is not so not to the level where we think it is there. Yeah. So I think communication is so important. But I think that has you've driven home that point. I think we really need to communicate better, even before it comes to that. If it all can be prevented if we communicate well right from the start. Yeah.
Right from the start. Absolutely.
Right from the start. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Shanti.
So much.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah. It's an honor to be here, and all the best to everyone.
Yeah. Okay. Good night. Okay.
Good night.
Okay, I'll end the broadcast. The video will still be there, so you guys can still scan. The code will be valid for maybe about another half an hour more or so. And if you can't scan the code, if you caught this talk late, you can still go to the bulletin board. Tomorrow, I'll host it in the bulletin board, and then some simple questions will be put up there, and including the keyword. And the keyword I'm going to mention now is rambutan. Okay, the keyword is rambutan, fruit. Okay. All right. Good night, everybody.